How we dress tells a lot about us, the time we live in, what we think of ourselves, and in some cases, our social status. And this has been so from the beginning of time. Come with me as I journey to the 5th and 6th centuries. Let's delve into the wardrobe of an Anglo-Saxon woman of that period. Who were the Anglo-Saxons? The Anglo-Saxons were a Germanic people who populated England from the 5th to the 11th century. They came from the regions known as modern-day Germany and Denmark. It was after the decline of Roman rule that they migrated to Britain. The Anglo-Saxon period incorporates several phases like the Heptarchy, a time of 7 separate Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. They had a warrior-based society, and their culture, language, Old English, and legal systems played a significant role in the development of England. During the Anglo-Saxon era, Christianity spread exponentially in Britain. An average Anglo-Saxon woman in the 5th and 6th centuries wore clothing that was functional and suited to their daily lives, which involved domestic work, child rearing, agricultural tasks, and textile production. Though there is not a lot of artifacts that remain as it relates to clothing from that time, scholars have used architectural evidence to reconstruct the clothing worn by women in the 5th and 6th centuries. In fact, a lot of this evidence came through exploring graves from that period. Women's clothing at that time had a variety of components. These components varied in both style and complexity. The following were the main parts of a typical woman's clothing: a shift, also called a smock or chemise, a tunic or dress, an overdress, outer cloak or shawl, a head covering, simple leather shoes, sandals or boots, depending on the season and the woman's activities, jewelry and accessories, girdles, as well as pendants. Now let's dive into each part with greater detail. An undergarment called a shift, smock or chemise was the first layer of clothing an Anglo-Saxon woman wore. It was essentially the foundation piece, as it was worn next to the skin. This article of clothing was loose-fitting, ankle length in most cases, and often made of linen. Most times it had sleeves and was very modest and comfortable. A tunic or dress was the outer garment worn over the shift. These were usually made of wool or linen and was the main outer garment, and it came in different styles, colors, and lengths. However, usually these garments had long sleeves and were ankle length. This clothing was often structured and included a bodice and a skirt, sometimes with seams for shaping. It was also common for women to wear a fabric sash or a girdle, which was draped around the waist, from which various items were suspended, like household keys, women's items like tweezers, nail scissors, ear scoops, as well as other interesting objects like small crystal balls and decorative spoon-like sieves. Similar items were found in a female grave in Chesildown Isle. An overdress was an optional piece. Many Anglo-Saxon women wore overdresses or pinafores, which were garments worn over the tunics or dresses. These were sometimes sleeveless or had short sleeves. An important accessory for women of that time were brooches. Tunics were fastened together at the shoulder by a pair of brooches. This style persisted way into the 11th century with Danish women. Anglo-Saxon women's clothing was mostly practical with a focus on functionality and protection. While it might not have been as fashionable as clothing in some other periods, it reflected their culture and heritage. Moreover, their clothing was thoughtfully designed to meet the challenges of the climate to keep the wearer comfortable in various weather conditions. It showed how resourceful and adaptable the people of that time period were. The weather in this region was quite variable with cool, damp, and sometimes unpredictable conditions. This is how weather affected the Anglo-Saxon woman's clothing at that time. The layering of garments depended on seasonal changes. In colder months, they would add additional layers such as a thicker tunic or leggings for warmth. Wool was the main material used for clothing during this period. Anglo-Saxon women wore woolen dresses, tunics, and cloaks to keep them warm in cold and damp weather. Their footwear was mainly simple leather boots to protect their feet from moisture and cold ground. Another factor that influenced Anglo-Saxon women's clothing in the 5th and 6th centuries was, of course, social class. Women in the upper class, which included queens and noblewomen, as expected, wore fancier and more luxurious attire. Their clothing was made with finely woven and decorated fabrics, elaborate embroidery, and lavish jewelry, which were oftentimes imported. Silk or high-quality wool or fur was normally used to make clothing for this social class. Their attire set them apart and showcased their wealth, privilege, and the power they had in society. Middle-class women wore clothing that was of good quality, but was not as elaborate as the upper class. They wore functional and durable woolen dresses and tunics that were not as adorned as their wealthier counterparts. As for the lower class women, practicality was paramount. They wore basic woolen garments, which were often plain, unembellished, reflecting their modest means. There is not much else to cover as it relates to the clothing of the Anglo-Saxon women of the 5th and 6th centuries. However, before I finish this video, I would like to talk a little bit about wool. In the 6th century, wool was an important material for clothing and textiles within the Anglo-Saxon society. Sheep farming was big business, and so there was an abundance of wool. There were many steps in the process of making wool. First, the sheep was sheared to get the wool fleece. The fleece was then cleaned up to get rid of dirt, grease, and other impurities. Thereafter, the wool fiber were combed in preparation for spinning. Women and skilled artisans had the task of spinning the wool into yarn by way of a drop spindle or spinning wheels. On upright or horizontal looms, yarn was then woven into fabric. Women and household members were usually a part of this step. The fabric was dyed using natural elements like plants, berries, and minerals to create various colors. Embroidery and embellishments were used to enhance garments for aesthetic appeal. The fabric was used to make various clothing and textiles, which showed the practical and artistic part of the Anglo-Saxon culture. We've come to the end of this video. Thank you for watching.